All right, everyone. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, depending on what time zone you're in. My name is Justin Ellis, Executive Director of Fuel for Truth, and this is our inaugural Israel Update webinar where myself and FFT Chairman Ron Wasserman break down what's going on in Israel, what you need to know, and to kind of separate fact from fiction, or at least to prioritize things you should be thinking about, things that aren't as important, and to kind of make sense of this crazy world that we're all living in and that continues to progress. For those of you who are not familiar with Fuel for Truth, we are a nonprofit organization that's committed to equipping young professionals with the knowledge, the tools, and the confidence to have today's ever increasingly difficult conversations about Israel, about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and more importantly, in a world where truth is becoming more and more subjective, where people are very tribalized in their politics, in their media sources. How do you have civil, effective, and persuasive conversations with those whose understanding of reality or a particular subject is not the same as yours? That's very much what we specialize in at Fuel for Truth. It's certainly something that separates us from a lot of different Israel education programs out there. And it really is the hallmark of our boot camp program. Before I introduce Ron and a little bit of what we're going to talk about today, it's very important that we talk about what boot camp is. Boot camp is our primary program for young professionals ages 22 to 40. It's a multi-session class in which we dive into the major history of Israel from the first Aliyah through 1948, 1949 to the present. We really break down the complexities of these major conflict issues, subjects that very much tend to come up in conversation often about Israel, whether that's the Palestine refugee issue, settlements, BDS, and things of that nature. And as I mentioned before, we really put into practice what we preach. It's not just here's some information, now go have fun with it in the world. It's we want you to feel comfortable, confident, and equipped to really have meaningful and civil and conversations that you are going to want to have again and again with people, and for those people to have conversations with you again and again about these subjects. So that's where we really talk about communication. We really bring in facets of social psychology for you to appreciate how decision-making is made, and certainly for you to control your emotions rather than your emotions controlling you. Boot camp, we are doing this online now. It starts October 27th. You can go to fuelfortruth.org/bootcamp for more information about the program as well as how to sign up. And I'd also be really remiss not to bring up the fact that we are very proud to be partners of Jewish National Fund. JNF is really leading the way in really setting the tone and helping prepare Israel for its future, really strengthening the land of Israel and the people of Israel. And it does this in a very unique way that most organizations aren't capable to do. I know most people are familiar with sort of the history of JNF with planting trees and the blue boxes like the one I have right up here. But a lot of what JNF does today is really about the future. These resource and development projects that JNF does is really helping real Israelis today and tomorrow. And JNF does unbelievable work. I really encourage you to learn more about what they do by going to jnf.org. Their upcoming national conference is actually starting October 18th, so the end of this week. All of you should definitely be attending that to really learn and see firsthand what they're doing. Obviously, given all that's going on, this is a virtual experience, but it will nonetheless be empowering, informative, and to give you more information about what JNF is doing and certainly how you can help and make a difference in really helping the future of Israel and its people. I'd like to introduce our chairman, Ron Wasserman, who is my partner in crime here on Israel Update. Ron, if you just want to introduce yourself, tell a little bit about yourself, as well as anything you want to add about boot camp or where Fuel for Truth is going in this new era.
Yeah, thank you, Justin. I think most of you know me, but for those who don't, Ron Wasserman, chairman of Fuel for Truth. I live in Great Neck, New York. I work for Signature Bank in the city. I've been involved with Fuel for Truth now. I honestly don't know, but it's certainly been more than a decade of being involved with the organization. I've been chairman for quite some time, taking Justin under my wing, and he's been running the organization in a manner I would expect nothing less from him. I grew up with an Israeli mother, an American father, spent my whole life really going to Israel. As I've told many in the class before, my Zionism was very organic. It wasn't really spoon-fed. We were going to Israel every summer to be with family. And my turning point for Israel was certainly for me the second Intifada. I was finishing up college, and I'll never forget. And it's funny, the anniversary was the other day when the two soldiers took the wrong turn. They were put into a police station. Everything was under control. Then the Palestinian security force let the mob into the police station, and the two soldiers were brutally killed. And we saw the famous picture that went around the world with the two bloody hands of the Palestinian out the window after they threw the dead body. That was a turning point for me. That is when Zionism took on a whole new avenue for me in my life. And when I got to the city, I found Fuel for Truth. And like Justin, I'm a product of the program. Did the program, volunteered, got involved, and that path led for me to be chairman. The only other thing I'd like to add is the partnership we now have with the JNF. It's been an unbelievable partnership, as Justin has found, like a kind of articulated. You think of JNF and maybe without knowing much about the organization, the first thing you think of is trees. But they do so much more. They have a profound impact on Israel, on American Jewry, the diaspora, and they've been an unbelievable partner. And as we always stress in boot camp, commitment. I'm committed to the organization. Justin is committed to the organization, and I'm thankful for the JNF's commitment and support to Fuel for Truth. And I'm looking forward to. It's been a while since I've gotten on the mic or gotten in front and really, dove deep on some of this stuff. So I'm excited. It's very therapeutic for me. I'm excited to get back into it.
Yeah, I don't think you and I have taught a session together since maybe the first week of March, or second week of March, pre-COVID. Yeah. So this therapeutic is a good way to describe this. This is really nice. So yeah, as I mentioned before, Israel Update. This is going to be our monthly webinar where Ron and I will kind of give you an update on what's going on in Israel, some things that are important to know about, some things to consider. And, obviously we're going to give the opportunity to also look ahead as far as what may be on the horizon. Given the fact that we just celebrated the Chagim, we just entered 5781. So a belated Rosh Chag Sameach, Shana Tova to all of you. With that, to kind of kick things off, I'd like Ron and to begin discussing, and I'll obviously chime in periodically. Let's talk about what happened to Israel over the past year. This was a major year for Israel diplomatically, I think, objectively speaking, in a way that has not been seen for quite some time. I'm sure all of you have certain things that come to mind when I say that, but, as the news cycle is and how our 15-second attention spans operate in this generation, there are many things that happened only months ago that we may not be thinking about, we may not be remembering, that are just as important. So Ron, I'd like to kind of, begin our first episode of Israel Update for you to kind of give an overview. What major things happened for Israel over the past year that have kind of set us up to where we are now?
I'm going to take it back a few years because I'd like to maybe go 3 years back, because it's really been a profound few years for Israel, certainly in the last year alone. But there's been a lot of incredible things that have happened that for some of us, we've been waiting for quite some time to maybe see come to fruition. And I think I'd like to start with, first of all, the embassy being established in Jerusalem. For those of us who have been to Israel many times, West Jerusalem, if we want to be technical, there really is no territorial dispute in that part of Jerusalem. It is Israel's capital. It's where all of its government headquarters, major institutions are. For a lot of us, we would be scratching our head as to the politics behind not putting it in Jerusalem. So I think the first big win for Israel and for a lot of us was finally moving the embassy to the capital of the Jewish state, which was Jerusalem. That was a major, major win. A lot of people had promised to do that, may have come close a few times, but we finally saw that happen a few years ago. Another big win for Israel, similar in logic, was recognizing sovereignty over the Golan Heights. As we know, the Golan Heights was part of Syria at one point. It's the high ground for those of us who've been there. The Syrians were using it to bomb Israel in many instances. The farmers below. It was taken by Israel in 1967. They annexed it, I believe, in the early 80s. And it's been disputed internationally as to who has sovereignty over this land. And I never understood it because it's a binary choice. Either you believe Syria should have control of that territory or Israel. And I don't know what kind of person would advocate for the Syrian regime, especially as we've seen what's been going on since 2011, could possibly advocate for Syrian sovereignty over that territory. I've always stated that as I've come around later in life, sometimes maybe the best policy should be what is best for the people on the ground living in the street. And I believe if you were to ask just about any person living in the Golan Heights, 9 to 9.9 out of 10 would prefer Israeli sovereignty over Syria. And the United States finally came out publicly and acknowledged Israeli sovereignty over the Golan Heights. The Iran deal, that was another good thing for Israel. The United States pulled out of the Iran deal. And by doing that, that allowed Congress in the US and some other countries to pile on sanctions. And the Iranian regime, we don't hear a lot about it in the news cycle, but the Iranian regime is getting punished. They are suffering, their economy, there's a lot of dissent and talks amongst the ranks. I've even been in briefings hearing where the IRGC is starting to question who they should be best aligned with 2, 3, 4, 5 years down the road. We've seen a complete turnaround in the way the West has been dealing, specifically the United States, with Iran. The killing of Qasem Soleimani was profound. If you could say who is the most dangerous human being to Israel, if you could pinpoint it to a human being, I think the consensus would be that Qasem Soleimani is the single dangerous human alive when it comes to the Jewish state. And I'm sure some other scumbag will probably come and pop his head up. We've seen that when a leader from Hezbollah or when Ariel Sharon back in after the Second Intifada was eliminating the top echelon of Hamas. It's like whack-a-mole. You get one and then another one will pop up. And I have no doubt another Qasem Soleimani will pop up in some time, but I'm not so sure that person will ever be as effective or be as powerful and cunning as Qasem Soleimani. We've always known that the Sunni Arab states have had these backdoor channels and relationships with Israel. And the mainstream of thought has always been that for that to take another step, peace with the Palestinians would have to come first. And almost immediately after, we would see what we just saw a few weeks ago with peace with the UAE and Bahrain. A very, very profound development in the Middle East for Israel, for the United States, for the region. We're going to dive a little bit deeper into that. But I think we just hit on a whole bunch of different wins for Israel. And I would just end in this diplomatically, not only within the Sunni states. Israel has been winning diplomatically on many different continents. It's been an unbelievable run for the Jewish state over the last 3-4 years, and even going back 5 or 6 years diplomatically with some of the relationships that were warming with India and Africa, and that has continued.
Ron, I want to go back to something that you had mentioned as far as, the U.S., finally moving the embassy to Jerusalem, something that was passed under U.S. law under the Clinton administration, had constantly been delayed by both Democratic and Republican presidents alike. As bipartisan as the passing of the law was to move the embassy, it was equally bipartisan to hold doing so. That, as well as recognition of the Golan, that I know this is something we talk in boot camp, but it's something I really want to reinforce, during this conversation, is that there are things that, depending on how you feel about it, if you're only going to look to, an arbitrary source to define whether this is okay or not okay in the case of what is legal versus not illegal, you're going to be very happy depending on which source of authority you subscribe to, or you're going to be very upset. That, remember, at one point, the UN in the 1970s, and I don't think this was revoked until the first Bush administration, the UN said Zionism was racism, right? That was a consensus amongst the international community. So when it comes to whether it's US law, Israeli law, or even the UN, I would try not to get so focused or tied up in terms of what is legal versus illegal. That is something that is very fluid, very flexible, and as I mentioned, very arbitrary depending on who's sort of putting their foot down and establishing the standard and the norm. And very much to what you said, what is best for people? What is actually going to be in the best interest of human beings who have to live with the consequence of decisions of governments, of policymakers? The law is not necessarily what is moral. If we want to even look at the Shoah, it was perfectly legal for the Nazis to do what they did. Slavery in the United States was once legal. That did not make these things okay. So for people to always, kind of draw the line, it was legal versus illegal, I don't think is the best or healthiest approach to look at. So I'm glad you clarified that in the process.
Yep. Listen, when it comes to the Jewish state, we talk about this in Fuel for Truth. You have to understand that religion, the Jewish religion, has a lot to do with some of these things that, again, would never take place in any other country, would never be subscribed to another nation. We would never question where another country's capital would be. Conveniently, only with the one and only Jewish state is that controversial. And for all the reasons that were given for so long, taking, again, international law or anything out of it, after it was done, nothing came to fruition. There were a lot of naysayers who maybe wanted it to happen, but were worried and were coming from a place of honesty saying, hey, well, if we do this, we heard about all kinds of violence and relationships, and there'd be, diplomatic consequences. And as we saw, which a lot of us did know, that none of that actually came to fruition.
Right. I'm still waiting for the other shoe to drop on that.
Correct. And listen, the old, one of my favorite Israeli characters is Abba Eban, as you know. The guy was just a genius, one of the all-time greatest diplomats from any country, I would argue, and goes to, you never miss an opportunity to miss an opportunity. And East Jerusalem isn't off the table. And I don't understand why the other side wouldn't be advocating, all right, well, if you gave them this, then give us that, instead of just a complete and total rejection of anything and everything, which they ultimately lose on. And forget about leadership. It's the Palestinians on the street that continue to lose as a result of failed leadership. And we dive a little bit deeper into another missed opportunity when we move into the Abraham Accords.
Yeah, and I think that's actually a perfect segue, talking about Palestinians never missing an opportunity to miss an opportunity. Let's talk about actual opportunities on the horizon, beginning with, as you mentioned, the Abraham Accords. This was a real historic moment for Israel, normalizing or beginning the normalization of relations with both the United Arab Emirates, the UAE, as well as Bahrain, two Sunni Gulf countries. Before we dive into that peace deal, I think it's really important for us to talk about what previous peace deals have looked like for Israel. And not really just to even show how similar they are, but also to show how incredibly different they've been, or certainly where the contrasting attributes are. Let's kind of go into a little brief history lesson here. Israel has diplomatic relations, prior to the Abraham Accords, with two Arab countries, officially on paper, meaning, there's no more belligerence or any act of war has been concluded. There's full recognition, diplomacies, embassies, all kind of the standard bearings of international relations that we see at like the most fundamental level. First with Egypt in the late 1970s and then Jordan in the mid 90s. Certainly with the difference between these two countries and what we're dealing with right now, there's some major differences here. We obviously fought multiple wars with Jordan and Egypt, very much over territory. They've killed our people, we've killed their people. Like, this was much more of an intimate conflict. This was active, like, belligerent violence in a way that we don't see, or that we've never had with any of these Gulf countries. We've never had a territorial dispute with them. We've never, this isn't so like ideological for them in the same way it was for Jordanians and Egyptians, not only because of their proximity to Israel, but also, like I mentioned, because of the multiple wars that we have fought over, territory and for other reasons over the past few decades. Is there anything you kind of want to highlight as far as what you think kind of is the difference?
Yeah, I'd like to give context. Correct. It's a great point, Justin. I'd like to give quick context to both Egypt and Jordan. As Justin stated, the Egyptian peace was over territory. And as we know, Sadat had no battle plan to fight Israel beyond the Sinai. If Israel was more in tune, and as was well written and documented now, there were many overtures that Israel was missing to come to the table diplomatically. Egypt wanted the Sinai back. And Sadat was clearly willing to do that. And even it really took Sadat coming to Jerusalem until a majority of Israelis were like, okay, this is real. We can actually make peace with these people. And as you said, with Egypt, there was a war, the Yom Kippur War, and peace resulted as, peace came as a result of the end of that conflict. Jordan was a little bit different, To give a little bit of context to Jordan, Jordan had sided with Saddam Hussein in the first Gulf War. Jordan is a country that I personally love. I've been there a few times. I find the Jordanian people to be wonderful human beings. They don't have natural resources. It's a very poor country. From what I understand, they're most known for their universities. A lot of Arabs from all over the Middle East come to Jordan to go to university there. And I'm saying this because they sided with Saddam Hussein, and as a result, all foreign aid was cut off. Jordan was very desperate and didn't have really territorial disputes because they ceased all claim to the West Bank prior to the peace. They wanted back in the good graces of the West, and they saw peace with Israel as a means to an end. And also the king, as we know, it's been written in many books, always had a backdoor channel to Israel. I even read in Martin Indyck's book that they had a special place for the king on top of Mossad headquarters where he could fly in, have meetings, and leave. Again, that was written in one of Martin Indyck's books about his time as ambassador to Israel. So yes, very different context of how peace came about, why it was motivated. And I think also important to touch on, Justin, and you can add your 2 cents, it never went down to the people. There is a peace between the militaries, between the leadership, at a very good level, and it seems to be strong in any briefing I've had. But are Egyptians coming to Tel Aviv? Are they going to visit Jerusalem? Are Israelis who love to travel anywhere they can? Are they going to Cairo and Alexandria and different places other than Petra, Jerash, and that's probably it for Jordan? Are Israelis, you don't see a flow of people, of ideas so much in the peace that they have with those two countries. And I believe that will be a major difference between the new peace that Israel has with the Sunni states. You'll have that government, you'll have the military. Clearly, there was a lot of motivation to do it on those two, along those two lines. But it seems to me that we're finally going to see a real peace between the peoples of Bahrain, United Arab Emirates, and Israel.
Yeah, you touched upon what I was definitely going to mention. I'm glad you did. That was always one of the things for me that, left me certainly wanting more, but also very cautious about the types of deals that Israel would get into in the future, was that if we were to look at the precedent of what Israeli peace and these peace deals had looked like leading up to that point with Egypt, with Jordan, very much to what you said, these were really deals, arrangements between regimes, between militaries, between certain business interests, but there was nothing human about it. This wasn't actual normalization, and this isn't even me coming into it with the expectation that our peace with those two countries, especially at the time in which they were signed, should resemble the relationship US has with Canada, or that England and France and Belgium and Germany share with each other today. But it was very much to note that this did not translate beyond the regime. And as I'm sure you and I know, but I'm not sure if all of our audience knows, these regimes are not exactly reflective of the population, whether because, they were set up as, sort of colonial tools of the West following World War I, and that's kind of been where they've still been going over the past century. But also, in some cases, you have minorities ruling over majorities, you have brutal military dictatorship. What the politicians and what the leaders do does not necessarily reflect what the people actually want, and certainly how they're feeling about the situation. So that has certainly always been my skepticism about these deals. Is this really what normalization really looks like? Is this what peace really looks like? Is this the best we can actually do for ourselves, for each other, for Israel's further integration into the Middle East? So, as we'll definitely talk about with the Abraham Accords, I am personally very excited about the potential for that human-to-human interaction, which definitely seems much, much more likely. That's not to say it'll be full-blown, daily flights between Dubai and Tel Aviv, and, everyone, studying at each other's universities and tourism. But I think there's a lot more potential in looking more like that than what we've previously had, and certainly very much an Emirati interest to direct it in that way. So that is one thing I'm personally excited about.
Where the term cold peace comes from when you're talking about Jordan and Egypt, that lack of human peace, human to human peace, the populations. It's often referred to as a cold peace, which Israel would take any day, but that's where that term comes from. And I would also argue that generational issues, during that time, for that population, the Palestinian issue was a core issue for Egyptians, for Jordanians. As we now are seeing the Palestinian issue with the failed leadership, missed opportunities left and right, the Palestinians haven't negotiated, even attempted a real negotiation since Bush. I mean, they had Obama in office for 8 years, probably the best advocate they're going to have in quite some time, and they wouldn't even negotiate. Forget about trying to pinpoint a line item on a deal, on an accord. They wouldn't even negotiate. So I feel that the Sunni Arabs, for sure, this is not a core issue. That was for their parents. That was for their grandparents. And that's why we believe will be a major contributing factor to a much warmer peace that we'll see with the Sunni Gulf states.
Yeah, I think one thing that definitely adds benefit to that is, to contrast with the case of Jordan and Egypt, it's not to say that Jordan and Egypt are so heterogeneous compared to the Gulf Arab states, but in terms of, the sociological structure, whether that being through like clans, families, certainly how the monarchies are structured, it is much more in line with sort of like the natural, like anthropological sort of ways of how these societies function. And, we can also look into what happened with the case of Jordan and Egypt, that, even prior to this peace deal with Israel in 1994, King Abdullah was assassinated on Temple Mount by a Palestinian in the early 1950s. Anwar Sadat, president of Egypt, was assassinated by Muslim Brotherhood elements in 1979 or 1980 following that peace deal. So there is a precedent.
Let's not forget
Rabin. Right. People don't really think like, what's the big deal with signing a piece of paper? It can very much cost you your life. For all of those who are listening, one documentary that Ron and I absolutely love, and we certainly encourage you to watch, is called Elusive Peace. I think this was a PBS documentary. You can find it on YouTube or Amazon, but it really documents the entire Oslo process and even afterward during the Second Intifada. But it was during that Oslo process and Camp David in 2000 that Arafat says very openly, if I agree to this as it's structured, I will be assassinated. And
by the way, that's a direct quote that they caught on camera.
Right. So it's not to say like he should have taken it or shouldn't take it. Like I'm not going to tell someone like what they should accept or what they feel is appropriate for themselves and their people. But it's important that we recognize what is actually influencing some of these decisions for these policymakers, that they may not live to actually see the deeds that they are, obviously engaging in.
So why don't we move on to my namesake. My middle name is Abraham.
Nice.
A fun fact: my mom was born in Nasiriyah, which was the modern day city of where Abraham was born in Iraq. So my middle name is Abraham. It's a name I am attached to, whether I like it or not, and I happen to love it. I'd like to start a little bit, Justin, and then I'll defer to you to fill in any holes. Very, very profound event in Israel's history in making peace with the Sunni states. Let me try and give you some background on some of this stuff. I've been on a lot of calls with some interesting individuals to get some background on this. The Sunni states are desperate for cyber, water, agriculture, technology, as well as in the case of the UAE, space. Obsessed with all these things, looking for any reason to come out in the open with Israel, and the annexation of the West Bank, they seem to the next best thing to peace. And as we now know, the Sunni Arab states really just, their hearts and souls are not in the Palestinian cause or issue anymore. And this is, in my opinion, this is in their own words. Sunni states have been really tough on the Palestinian leadership as of late. They certainly didn't take kindly to the criticism coming out of Ramallah as a result of the Abraham Accords. And it seems to me, especially if anyone has not read the interview with the former chief of intelligence of Saudi Arabia, bin Sultan, it was in the Times of Israel and it's on Al Arabiya. I encourage all of you to read the article, read his words. He articulates very clearly, I believe, where the Sunnis are at this moment in time with not the Palestinian people, but the Palestinian leadership. They needed a reason to do to make peace with Israel, to come out in the open for all the some of those reasons I just stated. And taking annexation off the table was a perfect opportunity for him. I would also argue that it was told to me on very high account and authority that Bibi was looking to walk back annexation. He had felt that he had went too far and was worried about the blowback, whether you agree with it or not, the blowback here in this country among Jews in the United States, amongst the Democratic Party, diplomats in Europe. I personally believe, my own opinion is that if you're going to talk about annexation, you should start with the 5 settlement blocks. I think it's a much easier pill for everyone to swallow. And I was told on very high account that Bibi was looking for a ladder to climb down. He wanted to walk that back a little bit, and the UAE came in with help from the United States, helped Bibi walk that back a little bit, and was able to get a big win for everybody in peace with Bahrain and the United Arab Emirates. I don't want to get political here at all, but I want to share something that was told to me on a podcast with Mordechai Kedar, and also shared with me by a high-ranking White House official, not in the current administration, but he served in the Reagan, both Bushes, Clinton, and Obama as a Middle East foreign policy advisor. The Sunnis are hedging their bets. The last Democratic administration that that was in power wasn't very kind to the Sunni states, empowered Iran, and they are worried that they may see another foreign policy that favors Iran. So the Sunni states want to hedge their bets. They were very motivated by the threat of that, trying to cover all their bases. That was another major thought process with the UAE and Bahrain in coming out to make peace with Israel. They want the F-35s. That's no secret unless you haven't read any articles in either US or Israeli papers. Hasn't been widely reported on. That I was on a call recently that was confirmed and verified. It's not so much in the public eye again, is the drones. The UAE, for defense against Iran, is very interested in drones that they couldn't get short of a peace deal with Israel. They will now have access to certain drone technology or aircraft as a result of the deal. I think one thing we oftentimes forget with Israel, again, I would attribute it to the religion of the state. Israel is the only state on planet Earth that has no access to capital or no trade in its region. I would challenge anyone on the call to show me a country that has pretty much been boycotted by all its neighbors and its entire region. Again, Israel has no access to capital markets, capital period, or trade in its own neighborhood. And that is one of the most profound things about this deal is Israel is now going to be able to, and I know they were doing some trade, some quiet, low-level stuff behind the scenes, but now Israel can finally do business, start to do business with some major players in the region who have piles and piles of cash ready to spend on Israel cyber, Israel water, Israel agriculture, Israel space. This will be a huge boon to Israel's economy and finally integrate her, like any other sovereign country, into its own neighborhood and its own neighbors. Obviously, when it comes from a military perspective, getting access to maybe some intelligence sharing and creating an even stronger alliance than it already existed against the looming threat of the Iranian regime. This was huge for Israel. I was shocked to see this go down. I was one of the guys who maybe naively or ignorantly thought that you really needed peace with the Palestinians for them to do this. I think for us who believe that, maybe didn't believe in that, believed in that thought process though as a reality, understated the lack of enthusiasm towards the Palestinian issue, which now that peace has been made, a lot of these Sunni leaders are coming out in public and telling us how they really feel about the leadership. And they're frustrated and they're fed up and they're ready to move on. And I believe, as we are clearly seeing the reaction on many social media platforms, their people are ready to move on.
Before I add my 2 cents to that, I just want to remind our audience here that, toward the end of this session, we really want to hear from you. We want you to help guide this discussion. We want to know what your thoughts are, what your questions are. So please use the Q&A function in Zoom. And then toward the end, we're going to use that to guide the rest of the conversation. Um, Ron, you got me thinking about one thing that was really interesting is that even just to show the difference of where the Arab countries are now, not just the Sunni Arab countries, but also just the Arab world, a huge contrast to only, 40 years ago. When Israel and Egypt signed peace, the Egyptians were accused of betraying the Palestinian cause and they were kicked out of the Arab League itself.
Correct.
They
Which
were
they
suspended.
shared. They were a major leader of the Arab League. And correct. They were thrown out of the Arab League for making peace with Israel. That was the reaction. Correct.
Right. And that was at the time which they were the leader of the Arab world. They were the strongest Arab country. So just in contrast now, once this agreement was signed, the Arab League got together. They would not condemn the UAE or Bahrain for doing it. Not one single member. They understood, like you said, they're reading the writing on the wall that from a military perspective, because of the threat of Iran and even Turkey for that matter, something that has not been talked about all too much, they are hedging their bets. They understand that Israel is, if you want to think about this as a stock or in a market sense, Israel stock is very bullish right now. And that's really the direction it's looking at for quite some time. While Arab stock and even the Palestinian stock more so is very bearish. Like that is really plummeting in value. A lot of that does begin, like you mentioned, from an economic perspective that, these Gulf countries whose really single, economic base is petroleum, is energy. The world's changing. Not only is oil running out, but also whether it's the United States, Canada, a lot of different countries, they are now tapping into their own energy supplies. They don't need to import Arab oil anymore. Not only that, but the transition to alternative forms of energy. They understand that they do not have a monopoly on any energy source anymore, but certainly the one that they do have a monopoly on is not going to be around for much longer. You see countries like the UAE that are much more pivoting to technology, to tourism, and very much like you said on the technological realm, whether that is a civilian application or a military one, that's what Israel specializes in and does better than any country in the world. And it's really been amazing to see that. On top of that, we were talking.
The Middle East is going to have a major, major water catastrophe.
Yeah.
Remember, Israel's not only a military superpower, and if you're worried about a threat from another country, it's in your best interest to maybe align yourself with a military superpower. Israel is a water superpower. Israel has the solutions to the problems facing the Arab Middle East. And again, they're not going to let the Palestinians get in the way any longer of prosperity for the people of the region.
Yeah, the Jordanians were even smart enough to see that, or we're talking now, 25 years ago, back in 1994, big part of that peace agreement between Israel and Jordan was not just security. It was just not, ending claims of conflict. It was Jordan to get access to water, whether that dealt with the Jordan River, the Kinneret, but also Israeli water technology, which we've now seen proliferate all over the world because of how specialized Israel is in developing that technology and changing the lives of different countries, whether that is in Africa, the Middle East, or anywhere else. Very much to expand on what you had mentioned as far as water and conflict. Natural resources cause more conflict than any other sociological or cultural issue. People fighting over resources to survive, that is a constant in human history, and that's not going to change just because we're in 2020 or 5781. If you want to even look at the Syrian civil war, a big issue that helped kick off that conflict was drought, was lack of access to water. And that was within a country. That wasn't even between countries. This was a domestic issue, not an international one. So when you amplify that on a much larger regional scale, one that is obviously as dry and barren as most of the Middle East, you're going to have a lot of problems unless you have the water technology to survive.
That's right. That's right. Who do you think is next, Justin? I'll start with you.
Oh, who do I think is next?
Next in line for peace with Israel.
All right. I don't have the official betting odds on me. I don't think Vegas released those anytime recently. That'd be very interesting to see whether it's Vegas or another sort of geopolitical consulting firm like put out actual betting lines for these like prop bets for different geopolitical issues. But at this point, I would honestly say Oman and Sudan are the clear favorites in my mind. And firstly, Oman. We've seen the close relationship that Israel has had with Oman, whether covertly and even more so overtly in the past few years. Prime Minister Netanyahu himself was hanging out in the capital of Oman, in Muscat, with the late Sultan Qaboos in a very sort of normal, natural, like intimate setting. And this was not a problem for the people of Oman. It was not a problem for the Israeli public. That seems to one that is going to become much more easy to achieve, in my view. On top of that, just because of where Oman is geographically, it obviously shares a border with the UAE. It's right next to Yemen. It is part of, sort of that Sunni Gulf bloc, even though it isn't so much oil driven, that really kind of makes it a natural ally to be the next signer of this accord. Because of its prior relationship with Israel, because of where it is geographically and geopolitically, that makes sense to me. Sudan, on the other hand, I think is a little less likely, but I think it's also possible. Certainly, we've seen more talks about that in recent weeks and months. Certainly the use of Sudanese airspace for Israel was a major thing. And also just, I think it's a little extra special to think about, considering that after the 6-day war, when the Arab League met in Khartoum, the capital of Sudan, to issue their 3 famous no's: no peace with Israel, no recognition of Israel, no negotiation with Israel, that Sudan would then become a country to do all of those things. Certainly, they are having their own water issues. They rely on the Nile the same way that Egypt does. For those of you who follow like a lot of African politics, Ethiopia and Egypt have had a lot of conflict over, accessing the Nile. Ethiopia has been building dams that has been restricting certain access for different areas. But for those reasons, I would say Oman and Sudan are my 2 favorites going forward.
Yeah, I would agree. Oman is a fascinating country. I'd like to spend just a minute on Oman. Oman in the 60s went through a civil war, and the only country to come to their aid was the British. And basically, it was, are radicals going to take over or moderates? And with help of British special forces, the moderates took over, and this guy Qaboos, who recently died, took over the country. And the most fascinating end to that story was, here you are in the Middle East, now you have another quote unquote dictator who takes over. But what were his first acts as leader of Oman? It was healthcare and education. He staged a coup against his father, Qaboos, to take control of the country until, I think, a few months ago. I think he died this year or last year. And he was all about the people, which in the Middle East he was an anomaly. And I've always been fascinated by Oman. I read a whole book about Oman because my curiosity took me there. And I'm surprised that Oman did not come out first, given that Oman was always the place that the US and Israel could go to interact with the Middle East. They were always the source of the backdoor connections. The moderate leadership of Qaboos, and his son seems to be following in his footsteps now. He's taken over. I'm surprised Oman did not already. I would be betting on Oman. We saw the US even seem to be pressuring with a visit from Pompeo, Secretary of State, to push Sudan. I believe it's only a matter of time. I was told by actually General H.R. McMaster, I was on a call with him a few weeks ago, and he said the Qataris, he goes, don't count them out. They don't like sitting on the sidelines and seeing what's going on with Israel. I'm not so convinced. There's a lot of issues there. Qatar supports a lot of bad actors in the Middle East who are hostile towards Israel. So as much as I'm sure they wanted to come out with Israel, that might get a little trickier. Saudi Arabia is interesting. Talked about this, Justin. King Salman comes from the school of the Egyptian peace and the Jordanian peace, where the Palestinian issue, he's a much older guy, is central to his core. And some things that I've been told on different calls is that Saudi Arabia is ready to go. It would be difficult to get it done, not impossible, and I'm not saying it won't happen, but King Salman is not going to be so jumping to make peace with the Jewish state. He's very old, he's sick. If he were to pass on, my bet would be that you'd see MBS probably make peace with Israel pretty quickly, in my own opinion.
Yeah, I mean, I think
they come out strong publicly saying no, but Morocco seems like low-hanging fruit along the lines of Oman. They had a Jewish population. They've always been good to the Jewish people. There's no war, no territorial dispute. Morocco hasn't really participated in some of the other warfare that the Sunni states used to practice against Israel, UAE included, whether it was economic, social, or supplying enemies of Israel. Morocco's been pretty neutral all these years. I would imagine, again, with some of these countries, you've been blaming Israel for decades for all your problems, and now you got to try to soften the blow when you come out and make peace. You have to sell it to the people.
Yeah, I think that's also one of the reasons why, obviously it started with what we originally thought was just going to be one country with the United Arab Emirates that obviously expanded to two, having Bahrain. Nobody wants to be the first, but also if you're going to do this in a real sort of strategic and diplomatic way, you don't want to give everything away at once. Like everything needs to be gradual. It needs to be increased over time. One, it obviously benefits the leaders and the policymakers. It's easy sort of, wins that they can kind of pull out of their pocket whenever they want going forward. But also, like you mentioned, some of the issues with these other countries are either in some cases simpler or easy enough, like Morocco, but could also be more complicated, like Qatar, due to its support of Hamas and other actors.
Muslim Brotherhood, yeah.
Right. It also does have a relationship with Iran, and it really,
Correct.
both literally and physically, if you look at a map, it is very much, squeezed between Iran and Saudi Arabia. And, they're not in the most fortunate positions where they have to hedge their bets in such a way. So I think that does play into that as well.
So we have about 10, 15 minutes left. Do you have some, I want to make sure if there are questions or people do want to get involved in the dialogue here, I want to make sure we do have enough time.
Mm-hmm.
Should we move on to questions?
Yes. Let's start off here. We have one from Todd Levy, good friend of ours who we're very close with. Todd is asking, you touched on Arab countries and Palestinians openly expressing their opinion on the Palestinian leadership. Has there been any change or talk of change in Palestinian leadership as a result of these recent developments?
No. Although Abu Mazen, again, I think he said he's going to go to elections, which he's threatened to do or said he was going to do many times. Good question, Todd. No. I was told recently on a call, again, from a very dialed-in individual, Abu Mazen is completely isolated. He's completely isolated amongst his party, amongst his friends, amongst his people. It's completely irrelevant. I doubt they'll hold elections and I don't want them to hold elections personally, because I believe Hamas would win those elections. And that is not good for Israel. That is not good for the Palestinians living anywhere. But no, there hasn't been a change. And I would also add that Abu Mazen's days are numbered from a health perspective. I'm told he's still a heavy smoker. He's got all kinds of health issues. The way it was explained to me by a high-ranking diplomat that we shouldn't expect, unfortunately, much of a change, even if Abu Mazen were to go. The way it was articulated to me, you're probably going to have to wait for the third or fourth guy to come in to start to see real change. Now, again, anything is possible. Things can turn in the Middle East like that. We saw that with the Arab Spring. We've seen it with other events going back 40 years. But I don't expect to see much change coming from the leadership anytime soon. And that would include even if Abu Mazen were to either relinquish power because he's too sick or die.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not overly optimistic about that as well. As we were talking about with the development of Israel's relationships with the Sunni Gulf Arab states and the wider Arab world in general, that has very much come at expense of the PA and the PLO, in which, their value, their reputation, the role that they play has been largely diminished, over the past 25 years. Ironically, something like Oslo, which was supposed to empower the PLO, empower the PA, which obviously did in some ways, in which they were having direct control and rule over the lives of Palestinians in certain capacities, is now ultimately all diminished in terms of their reputation and what sort of they offer and what they're able to control when it comes to not only their relationship with the other Arab countries, but also with Israel. And even on a domestic level, the Palestinian population, much younger population, doesn't feel the same way about the PA and the PLO that it used to. And that's not to say that they're now all suddenly Zionists and like Israel or whatever. That's far from the case. But the calculus that they're all going through is not about, where is the next Arafat and when are we going to sign a piece of paper and get us, greater civil rights or autonomy. It's, okay, we've been stuck in this. We're stuck with this leadership that was largely foisted upon us from the outside. How do we actually move on, whether that's 2 states, whether that's 1 state, whether that's 5 states? let's just get going with something else other than what we have right now. So the role that the PA and the PLO plays, and obviously, as Ron mentioned, with Abbas in particular, due to his advanced age, his poor health, and people just kind of growing tired of him, I don't really see much of a role that he can offer for better or for worse going forward. Let's address another question here from Julia. Ron, what articles and or resources did you mention or do you recommend? She would love to read and follow them, loves this type of talk. What are some resources you can recommend based on the conversation we've been having today?
I would recommend, first of all, it's always good, putting politics aside, to read the world section or international news section of whether it's left, right, or center in the US. So I'd say a quick start, even if you're not going to read, maybe just check the headlines. Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, New York Times, Fox, CNN, that's a low-hanging fruit. If you want to dive deeper in some of the better places I like to go is the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. Always has unbelievable, very thoughtful analysis on the Middle East. I think you would find it far more interesting there. I love the Foundations for Defense of Democracy. I would be going there. The National Institute of War every once in a while, may not be so Israel, but they're always writing about what's going on in the Middle East if you want to raise your IQ. I personally like the Times of Israel as of late, and Ynet News for Israel, both in English. And also, if you find a topic, there's nothing better than actually reading a book. Obviously, if you're just looking for what's going on in the news, what's going on today, you're not going to find a book to help you there. But if you ever find an article or an issue that you really are interested in, I highly recommend tracking down a book on the topic and reading it.
And, I kind of want to offer the other side of the coin here. One of the things that, as I mentioned in the introduction, that makes Fuel for Truth so special and so unique is the communication lens that we bring to what we teach and how we're going about having these conversations. And a lot of that, and this is very much what we do in our classes, does require you to assume the point of view of those you may disagree with or don't understand, as uncomfortable and as difficult as that may be, not because you're looking to agree with them, not because you think it's going to somehow, maybe add value to what you already know, even though it could, but for you to appreciate that you can learn a lot from the other perspective or the other side based on how the other side actually sees themselves. I think for the most part, when people are talking about themselves or, their perspectives, they're telling you the truth. People don't wake up in the morning and say, like, how can I be the biggest enemy or obstacle to Israel? Or how can I be the biggest enemy or obstacle in life for Justin or for Ron or for someone else? Everyone is, the protagonist in their own story. And therefore, I would encourage you to actually look at certain resources and certain publications that will actually tell you how the other does authentically see themselves. And like I said, not so you could, agree with it, but so you could actually have a really informed opinion about what they're thinking and what processes they're going through to form those opinions. That's going to make you far more educated and far more sophisticated when it comes to analyzing the situation. So with that, I would really recommend a lot of Arab news outlets, whether that's Al Arabiya, which I think for most of us who are not familiar with the Arab perspective or have like a very sort of rooted pro-Israel perspective, that's usually an easier one to start with. But I would even read Al Jazeera or even some Palestinian English papers for you to really just understand, like, what are they actually thinking? How are they coming to these conclusions? And certainly how you can better understand that in order to form your own opinions and certainly the conversations you're going to facilitate. So I would really just try to keep that as broad a spectrum as possible. And, just to beat a dead horse again, not so you agree with it, but so you actually understand it the way they understand it themselves.
Justin, you brought up a great point there. I used to, back in my younger days, before kids and everything, I used to read a lot of the Arab papers. The Daily Star is a Lebanese paper. Mm-hmm. I used to just, would like to see, and it's funny, you see a lot of the Arab papers recycling Haaretz articles as, confirmation for whatever they're trying. I found a lot of Haaretz references in the Arab world's papers. There was ArabNews.com. You mentioned Al Arabiya. I think Al Haram was an Egyptian one I used to peruse through, the Daily Star. But Justin brought up a good point. Regardless, if you just Google some of the other countries, it can sometimes be quite fascinating to see how they're reporting and through what lens they view a particular issue that you might be interested in.
Yeah. Well, I want to, take this time before we kind of wrap things up to thank everyone for being part of this debut of Israel Update. This was great. Ron and I don't get to spend as much time with each other personally or professionally as we used to. So this was a wonderful thing for us, but it was also wonderful to bring you guys into it as well. Just some closing remarks here. We have some upcoming events that we really want you all to be a part of on Monday, October 26th. So this is a week before the US election. We are very privileged to be hosting a webinar with Seth Frantzman. He is the Middle East Affairs Analyst for the Jerusalem Post, in which he's going to be talking about his feelings on what the US election is going to look like, and more accurately or more specifically, how, whether it's another 4 years of a Trump administration or brand new 4 years of a Biden administration, what will that likely look like for Israel and for the countries of the Middle East? So a lot of good forecasting for that. As I mentioned before, our flagship bootcamp program for young professionals, where we talk about a lot of things that Ron and I discussed today, but certainly in a lot more breadth and depth. That starts on Tuesday, October 27th. Just go to fuelfortruth.org, go to the bootcamp page to sign up. It's really all you have to do, and it's a great experience. We're both products of the program. A lot of people in our audience today are products of the program. It's life-changing. Our next Israel update is currently scheduled for Wednesday, November 4th, so right after the election. There should be plenty of material for us to discuss at that point. But as I mentioned before, also JNF National Conference starting on October 18th, really to see, feel, and understand how JNF is transforming Israel, is revolutionizing it in terms of resource and development, setting the stage for a future Israel for its land and its people. Really encourage you guys to check out jnf.org to learn more about that. Thank you all again for joining us for our inaugural Israel update, and we can't wait to have you here next time.
All the best, everyone.
Have a good one, everyone.